Hello, I'm Dr. Amber Love Johnson, and this is the EduCurious Podcast, where we highlight exceptional educators and dive deep into complex issues. Today's guest is Superintendent Fred Heid of the Polk County School System, one of the largest and most populated counties in Florida. So, good morning, Mr. Heid, and welcome to the show.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm so happy to have your time for a little bit this morning to go over educational questions and just concepts. So thank you again.
My pleasure.
I would like to start off by tell me just a little bit about yourself, like what got you to the role of superintendent?
I actually never started in public education as my interest. I was a biology major and thought that I would go into environmental science. And I ended up, in order to graduate, I was missing a liberal arts credit. And my counselor at the time recommended an intro to elementary ed course and fell in love with it. And from that moment forward, kind of progressed and got my dual bachelor's in biology and in secondary ed, and then continued to proceed to earn a master's, and then almost now with my doctorate. I've been incredibly fortunate. I never pursued the superintendency. I truly believe my career path is a really good example of if you do what you love and you do it well, opportunities will present themselves. And so I never had to chase the role. I was very fortunate that opportunities just simply presented themselves to me. Even with my first superintendency in Illinois for 7 years, I was contacted by a recruiter because somebody else had given them my name. So that's how the pathway started. And it has 27 years in public education. This is my 12th year as a superintendent, and it's been fantastic.
What's one of your favorite attributes or aspects of being superintendent in our county in particular?
You know, and it's one of the things that actually drew me here because I was very happy in my previous district, and I was asked to apply, or I had an interest through the recruiting firm that the district had hired, or the search firm, I should say. And when we visited, what is amazing about Polk County is the sincere interest in the fact that the public schools have to thrive. They must be successful. Everyone shared that commitment and that expectation. And so from my perspective, that makes their job that much easier because now you have this willingness in the community for change efforts, for innovation, sustaining high performing, high interest programs. And so I just saw it as the best foundation moving forward for me and for the district. So I think that's one of the things that we have going for us here in Polk County.
I've had the pleasure of sitting in some of your board meetings, and I'm so impressed with the collaboration that takes place within those meetings to accomplish a unified goal. What are you and your board's plans for this great expanse of the population growth that's coming to Polk County to make sure that you grow with our population?
Right now, we're in the process. We just completed the high school rezoning initiatives, and we're in the process of rezoning all of our elementary schools and middle schools. So there's an aspect of that, right? So rezoning, which hasn't been done in this district in over probably 20 years, other than isolated things. Like when you open a new school, you always rezone. But rezoning, comprehensive rezoning hasn't been done in over 20 years. That will then readjust some of our existing schools to increase the ROI for our taxpayers and increase the school utilization. Majority of our schools are over 85% utilized, but we do have some pockets where growth has been stagnant. And as you know, Polk County is growing. I call it love handles because we're growing on the east side, we're growing on the west side. And that's where our population growth and density is it really is right now. So for us, it's also about new construction, and we've also embraced expanding existing facilities. So it's really a three-prong approach to how we're managing growth. Rezoning obviously redistributes students in a meaningful way, but in an appropriate way, right? We don't want people having to drive past the school to go to a school unless that's a choice effort. Adding new facilities is something that every school district has to look at during times when growth is occurring. But we want to be very intentional about spending that amount of money to build a new facility versus if you look at things like McLaughlin, which is now a middle high, you look at Citrus Ridge, which we now added middle school to Bellicita to help balance their overall enrollment. So I think we're being very intentional and very strategic about how we address growth in our county.
And with the growth, there's the aspect of leadership. How do you ensure that you're building capacity with growing exceptional leaders within education to take on that role?
And what I'm about to say is not a criticism of the program we had previously. It just wasn't culminating in success for applicants. So we had a program, several hundred people had gone through it, but less than a 3% placement rate for those individuals. So they were applying, they were interviewing, but they weren't successfully getting those job opportunities to move into the role as an assistant principal, or even into district leadership roles. So about 4 years ago, we started and completely revamped all of our leadership pipeline programs. And then even now, for existing leaders, we created a mentoring support program for them in their first and second year. It's required. And that way they can continue to further their growth in the profession, and they can start to identify other potential departments that they may have an interest in. The superintendency obviously is not the only high role in a school district. You have a lot of roles that we rely on. We have the assistant superintendent of transportation and student services. We have assistant superintendent over IT network, security, and instruction. We also have the assistant superintendent for human resources. So what we're allowing is job shadowing opportunities to create a pipeline for future subsequent leaders. And that succession leadership to me is very important. If I have a legacy or a goal, one of many, that I'd like to leave behind, it would be that Polk County does not have to hire a search firm again to find their next superintendent, that if I've done my job well, I'll have the bench of applicants who are poised to be the next leader in Polk County.
On that note, how do you prioritize accountability with the leadership within your school and the students and just the educators in general, the teachers, the leadership, and the students, that accountability factor?
I'm a firm believer in accountability. My whole career, whether it was with the Department of Education, dealing with low performing schools, it's always been about student outcomes and accountability. But also, it has to be balanced. You can't just force accountability on individuals without having first ensured that they're coached and trained properly. And we have to get beyond and support individuals that you can have difficult conversations and still keep the person intact. You do not have to have an overly aggressive or demeaning or disrespectful conversation with someone to highlight an area or areas of needed improvement. It really should be a coaching conversation, and we should put those elements in there. So that's what we try to emulate here is we give training. How do you coach? How do you support? How do you have difficult conversations? How do you help disarm an individual and make them more receptive to feedback? And then creating plans together. So if an individual, we have performance plans, growth plans, but they have to be done with a level of sincerity and a level of support that ensures that the individual has an opportunity to truly be successful and to learn and grow. So I think you have to have a balance between demanding high expectations, high performance, better outcomes, but also reflecting, was the individual properly trained? Do they understand what we're talking about? Do they understand how to support that? Also with the understanding that at some point, if someone has been unresponsive to coaching and to feedback, then you have to go in a different direction. But, that's just my approach. I think in this era where we're not getting countless applicants for vacancies, we need to be more intentional in how we train, coach, and support the individuals we do select critically to fill these roles. And then beyond that, I think we have to be more honest. It's never been a question that when you look at the statistics of evaluations, right? Performance evaluations, regardless of whether or not they're classroom evaluations, principal evaluations, or even senior administrative evaluations. You can't have schools that have consistently been underperforming and yet everybody gets a highly effective rating, right? I think that there's a lack of honesty and integrity in some of those, and you need to be prepared to have more honest, more sincere conversations because you can't improve if you don't identify the areas for improvement. But again, it doesn't mean you lead with a stick, you lead with a carrot. You've got to be able to support individuals so that they share that vision, they understand the expectation, and you can create a roadmap with them for training, for support, for mentors, for collaboration, so that they can achieve that rather than just simply saying, I'm demanding this of you, and you walk away and you provide zero support whatsoever.
And that transfers directly into a model of a classroom setup, giving the kids their expectations and then the follow through and the assessment. So, how do you feel that we as educators can best support students with that same framework of the carrot rather than the stick?
Being reflective, identifying how students can best demonstrate their level of understanding and proficiency. It's not always a written exam. It could be a hands-on application. The majority of my grades were not dependent on a test on a Friday. They were dependent on labs and students being able to demonstrate their knowledge and understanding of those topics that we were covering. When we did anatomy and physiology and we talked about the human skeletal system, I did not have a paper test that showed the skeleton and said, okay, name these bones. I laid all the bones out on a table, put numbers on them, and the students walked around with clipboards and they had to identify those bones. So it's just a different approach, and they felt it was a more mature approach for many of them. But in other areas, just giving them an opportunity to demonstrate their knowledge and experience, and again, their level, being able to demonstrate satisfactory outcomes doesn't always come in the form of a paper test. Sometimes it should be a verbal assessment with certain students. Sometimes it should be a hands-on, demonstrable outcome that a student can perform. We do that in the fine arts. A student can perform on a violin or a cello or in a choral ensemble, and we evaluate them based off the performance. So why are we not similarly reflecting that in our classrooms? So I think educators need to be flexible in how they're assessing student performance and student growth. And I think accountability for students is not the grade. If you give a student a 0, if you give a student an F, you're making an excuse. So Dufour used to say, he used to liken it to a parent, right? So you have a child at home and you tell them they need to mow the lawn or clean up their room, and they don't do it. As a parent, you're not going to say, well, I'll do it for you and we'll try better next time, right? That's the argument of the 0 and the F, is that, well, I'm holding you accountable. But Dufour's argument was you should still force the student to have to do the task. And so when it comes to missing assignments, if we believe as educators that that assignment was so important that it ultimately is going to result in a grade being issued, why are we letting students off the hook? Why are we not holding them accountable to say, no, you still owe me this? That's the real world example. If the student, if it goes into the workplace and fails to perform a task, the boss isn't going to say, oh, get it to me next time. The state of Florida says, Mr. Heid, you've got a safety report due, and I don't turn it in. The state's not going to ignore me and say, well, we'll just skip that. Mr. Heid gets a 0. Next year, we'll come back and give him another chance. No, they demand the outcome. And I think we need to get more comfortable with that as educators, that grading should not be about jumping through the hoop. It should be, has the student truly demonstrated competency, learning, growth, and grade level knowledge?
There's some debate on charter school, county school, because charter has, it appears, more flexibility. But what you just said was you are supporting the educators within the Polk County school system to provide learning opportunities that best fit the student. And that is sort of something that needs to be known, because I think that is so important. And the fact that you're building that culture within your schools is phenomenal. What other ways do you build positive culture within your schools? Because they're so different depending on the place they are in the county, because our county's so big.
Part of that's trust, on my part, because I'm not going to be able to directly interact with 117, 118,000 students and families or our staff. We have almost 14,000 staff. So part of it's trusting and ensuring that our principals and our department head leaders understand the expectation. If you coach, you create a culture of trust and mutual respect and collaboration. And so at our schools, we've spent an inordinate amount of time over the last 2 years retraining on parent engagement, on supporting our classrooms. This year, as an example, we worked with our union, and they would like to see climate surveys brought back at all of our schools. And so we will be doing that. But at the same time, we're going to allow, at middle school and high school, we're going to allow people to provide feedback on teachers in a survey. The goal for both of us is not for it to be punitive, it's for it to be a growth opportunity. We will take that information and share it as needed, filter it, redact it to the extent that it needs to be done, and then be able to present that in a way that becomes that opportunity to reflect and to grow and to improve. So the overall culture, too, is also reliant upon standardizing expectations, ensuring that our school climates and schools climate there is conducive to teaching and learning and supportive of that. And part of that starts with safety and ensuring proper disciplinary procedures. We try our very best each year to make sure we bargain in good faith so that our teachers and our employees feel valued and respected in the process. I think that's important as well. We also provide a voice. Recently, we had a student, second grader from Valley View Elementary, who contacted me directly with her mom's support, obviously, and said, Mr. Hyde, I'd like to talk to you because the toilet paper in Polk County Public Schools isn't very good. So I met with her and her mother at the school, along with a school board member who represents that area. And we had a conversation. She was very well prepared. She was incredibly articulate, brought samples, the whole thing. And the concern was that at some point, I guess we had changed our toilet paper procurement. And she was right. So one of the things she raised, this is a second grader. So think about the advocacy that this young lady is demonstrating, but also her ability to problem solve, right? She knew if I'm going to present this, I need to do it in a certain way. So she shared, I asked our custodian, he's having to repair and unclog toilets more frequently because students are having to use more toilet paper than they did before. I mean, it seems like a ridiculous conversation, right? But the agency and the advocacy that this student was able to demonstrate, we wanted to be respectful towards, and we actually did some research and found out she was right. We were using more than we were previously, and we were actually having more repair orders than previously. And so as a result, we went back and we modified the product, and we buy a better quality product now. And it's been noticed by everyone. You'd be shocked at how many people talk about toilet paper in a workplace, um, think about that. Something as simple as that, giving agency and voice to others, has such a huge, meaningful impact. Since we reverted back to a better quality product, um, I've not heard any complaints. And in fact, all I hear about, as much as I joke about, you'd never think people talk about this as much in the workplace, it's having an impact. People talk about it openly and say, thank you, we're glad that we did this. And so it's the little things sometimes I think we ignore. We look for those big, low-hanging fruit opportunities, but there are so many right in front of us that can have a direct impact on morale and culture and all of those things that I think we need to be a little bit more attentive to those details. And I was thrilled to be able to support a second grader and in what she was able to do. And we give her credit. She came to a school board meeting and presented, and it was amazing.
That's a great example. So the term in education is often, and you're talking about grades and accountability, but it's the achievement gap. How are we bridging the achievement gap? What's your perspective on measuring that gap and then filling the gap, bridging the gap, and providing the best atmosphere for the students?
This will probably be the most controversial answer I give you, because I have very strong feelings about this. I'm a huge proponent. I will always support accountability. Taxpayers deserve to know what the ROI is for them as far as student graduation rates. How are school districts doing? That we've reached a point where there needs to be a lot more conversation around how we're assessing and what we're truly assessing. So when people look at the state's overall reading proficiency rates and school district proficiency rates, and they're like, oh my God, 40% of the kids aren't reading on grade level. But here's what's interesting. So when you look at high school in particular, in order for those students to graduate, they must pass the Florida reading assessment or get an equitable concordance score on the SAT or the ACT. So when over 85% of the students that can't pass or don't pass the state's traditional ELA assessment are passing and graduating because they're achieving a concordance score through SAT or ACT, I'm going to argue all day long there's a disconnect there. Because if students can perform better there and meet the graduation criteria, what is it about the high school exam that's creating that deficiency or that gap? And I think there's a lot of reasons. I think it starts in third grade, when a student is identified as reading below grade level, and then they end up in a reading intervention class. So by the time they get to high school, some of those students gave up in sixth and seventh grade. They no longer even try on the test because they're like, I'm going to be stuck in this class anyways and lose an elective. So why am I putting forth effort? But now you tell them take the SAT and ACT and you create that college and career connection for them. And now they're being successful. So I think there's a lot to that. That's a really interesting question that you ask, and one that's going to require a lot more research and a lot more dialogue with practitioners and legislators. By no means am I asking us to move away from an accountability system. I just want to make sure that it measures the things it's supposed to be measuring and that we're being honest about student outcomes. I participated in a state level group when new cut scores were being issued. That committee, there were several superintendents, several community leaders, parent groups, advocacy groups that were all in a room at the same time that I was in a room. Then the state did a concurrent session with educators across the state. And my group and the educator group both made recommendations for cut scores. The state did not adopt any of our recommendations, none. So the actual practitioners in the room, and including groups that wanted to have more accountability. The state did not adopt that, and they changed the cut scores. And when you look at how cut scores were changed, it basically forced us into a pattern where, well, historically, only this percentage of students have been successful in the third grade score. We want to maintain that. No, you should have an assessment that reflects all student capacity, right? It's like the argument about the A. If every student in the class passes an exam with a 90% or higher, you don't change your grading scale. You celebrate the fact that it's okay for all of those students who have demonstrated that level of proficiency. You don't artificially suppress student performance. And I think there's a lot to this conversation about, are we really measuring? Are we being honest with our data? And I think there's a lot to this.
So, as we're looking at how we measure and assess and provide clear and transparent results, there's a lot around the conversation also of AI and how do we use that as a tool instead of like oh my gosh, how do we keep this from our kids?
I think we all recognize there's great potential there. I see more potential in student support services. I think there's great potential for staff, for planning purposes, for assessment purposes, record keeping, scoring, those types of things. And I'll give you an example. IEP meetings. There are AI utilities now that specialize in capturing and recording those meetings when the parents show up, the IEP team convenes. Then that data set from our focus system, as far as student performance, discipline, attendance, can all be fed into it. And then it will actually create a recommended IEP plan or a 504 plan for those students. It'll also translate into multiple languages. And it really is a strong mechanism. Now, understand AI is not independent of us creating that. There's a vetting process clearly afterwards, because I know that's a concern. But we get more appropriate plans. They're very detailed. The outcomes are measurable and demonstrable. The goals are appropriate. There's opportunities where our ELL parents to use AI utilities for translation services during meetings. I mean, there's a lot of opportunity that will open the door for better parental engagement, better parental involvement, and better support for our staff. We've been very intentional in going into AI for students and for staff very slowly, largely because there's been federal policy about AI. There's now state policy. They're talking about coming up with a state policy during this next legislative session. The governor announced yesterday. That's one of his initiatives. So I think we want to be cautious and supportive. There's a lot of training that has to happen around it. We're currently piloting Copilot in the district. I think it's a very useful tool. I think people have to understand, because I get quite a few emails where it's very obvious that somebody used ChatGPT, because the same pattern, word pattern's always there, and flow is always there. You know, it's great to use that, but that should not be your final edited version. It really should be trying to personalize it or humanize it after the fact. I see great potential in it. The question's going to be, how do we put the safeguards around it to protect student data privacy, to protect students, and academic integrity? I think that's what my teachers worry about the most, is the academic integrity piece. You know, and colleges are leading the way. Miami-Dade just has a fantastic program and process in place, and we've been visiting with them. And several of my team, in fact, right now, are convening about our AI policies so that once the board adopts those, we can then move forward with procedures to support AI rollout and what software we're going to allow.
And it's just evolving so quickly. So the fact that you're already engaged in this is huge. And I'm curious about it because we get a lot of questions about that from a discipline standpoint as well. So I have a last question so I can let you get on with running things in Polk County. Um, what belief about education or leadership have you had to rethink over time? And as you've been in this role for a while, and what led to that shift?
You know, within my very first year as a superintendent, here's the lesson I've learned, and it has stuck with me. My job is to set the vision and the goals. If the board gives me my goals, I set the goals beyond that, and I set the expectation. I had to get very comfortable recognizing that I needed to be less concerned how everybody got there and more concerned about how do I support them in just getting there. They don't have to do it the way I would do it. And I was stuck in that initially for the first few months as a superintendent. Well, I wouldn't do it that way. I don't want it done that way. And it really took me a little bit more reflective time during my first year to realize the outcome is what's important. How someone chooses to get there with parameters, right? We're talking they have to do it legally, they have to do it ethically. I shouldn't second guess. I'm empowering them as leaders to do their job to attain a goal, get out of the way. And I think that's something that was one of my, and continues to be one of my strongest takeaways. as far as a leadership paradigm, that's a reasonable expectation to put on yourself, is to take a step back, be willing to let people lead. You have hired them, you've supported them. Now, why would you micromanage them? And that's a balance that we all have to strike sometimes. But I would argue that that's the lesson I learned very early on.
Great answer.
Thank you.
And thanks for spending time with me this morning. Do you have any closing thoughts or anything you want to add?
No, I would just say thank you very much for the opportunity. You and I have interacted on several occasions, going back to grant funding and all kinds of other things. So I'm thrilled to see you continuing on your professional pathway. And for those who may ultimately end up listening to this, I would hope you have some takeaways from this, if nothing else, just to be reflective practitioners. None of us benefit from a standardized, structured approach to everything. My leadership is very much a situational leadership approach, and my responses will always reflect the demands of the issue. There's a big difference between dealing with a school discipline event that a parent's upset about or may want to appeal versus an emergency where you may have to close the school and reunify students. So your response should reflect those things, and you need to be flexible, and you need to respect and honor those you've put around you to support you in this capacity. And if as a leader, if you can do those things, you'll be successful. The other thing is, be very selective in what you choose to pursue. Do it because it's in your heart, not because you want more in your wallet. If you do what you love, money follows. It will always follow. Your passion will come through, opportunities will present themselves, and be open to that, because you may find yourself, if you'd have told me 20 plus years ago when I first started in education that I would be a superintendent, I'd have told you were crazy. I'd have told you, no, don't want it, not interested. And yet here I am. And it's happened because I followed my heart, and I taught well, Sarasota County Teacher of the Year, and opportunities presented themselves to me, and I wasn't scared to take them in the right situations. But don't take a job just because of the paycheck. Take the job because it's something that aligns with you personally and professionally, as far as your ideology, your morals, your values, and ultimately you'll be successful. And I would argue more successful as a result. So thank you.
I always take away lots to think about and ponder after conversations with you, and I really appreciate your time. So, whether you're a teacher, a parent, or just EduCurious, join the community as we explore various educational topics and learn from each other. We will see you next time.